Welcome back to another reading and correcting of Bottom Rung with me, Kindar, the Tiger Writes, and Ty, the Tiger Supervises. Today we are doing chapter 28. You heard about the other team who beat the boss? Karina asked, joining Tibs and Jackal at their usual table. She waved to Krosef. Finally, Jackal said. I can't believe it took this long for another team to manage it. Now people can go pester them for what it's like to fight it and how to beat it. Maybe one of them will brag about it, Tibs said, thinking of the number of times he'd had to remind Jackal they weren't allowed to say anything about what took place in the dungeon outside of it. To remind Jekyll they weren't allowed to say anything about what took place in the dungeon outside of it. I can't tell if there should be a comma there. And they can deal with the consequences, the fighter said. This rule was made to torture me specifically. I just know it. It was such an amazing fight. You were amazing in it. I was amazing in it. I can't tell a soul. Yeah. This is a word I want to avoid. Can't tell anyone. He rested his head on the table. We're going to die in obscurity. I like obscurity, Tip said. Jekyll glared at him. You're a rogue. You love obscurity. I'm a fighter. I should be able to be famous for my battle. How is that going to happen if I can't tell my stories? What stories? Joseph asked, placing a plate of stew and tankard of ale before Karina. The one about the dungeon, Jekyll said, and Tips narrowed his eyes at Krosef. Did he tell you? Me? The server said, acting far too innocently. I have no idea what you're talking about. What he's talking about. He hurried away, and Tips turned to glare at it, to turn his glare on the fighter. What? Jekyll asked, and mouthed, he's Krosef. You realize you're placing him in danger too, right? Kirina asked. Just let me have that, okay? He asked, and then muttered, at least he likes my stories. Everyone likes them, Kirina said. That's just one you can't tell yet. I'm sure once everyone can beat the golem, no one's going to care who was first. You see, that's what you don't understand. That's why I have to be able to tell the story now, before there's a dozen other flying around town all claiming to be first. We beat it. We should be telling it. We'll still be first, Tib said. No one's going to forget us and the shield, unfortunately. Jekyll grumbled. Sounds like you don't know what you want, Kirina said, pausing as she ate. You can't be remembered for one thing and not the other. It's the guard, Tip said, isn't it? How did it go from that team? How did it go for that team who beat the boss? Jekyll asked. Was their loot better than ours? Tip shrugged at Kirina's look. Jekyll wouldn't say anything about the man he'd called Harry Hart. It's Harry. It's Hard Knuckle Harry. I can change it later, but for now it's still done. Each time Tibs tried, he changed the subject without even trying to print it, and he hadn't heard. I didn't see what it was, so smaller than ours, but with dungeon loot that can't mean much. There was some arguing at the table. From what I was told, the adventurer there tried to convince them the guild would give them a better price for it than the merchants, because the guild was fair and the merchant were crooks. Jekyll choked on his swallow. Tell me they didn't believe whoever that was. Now, they're probably doing the rounds of the shop now to see what they can get. They should see Darren. Since... Oh, what? Okay. I need to go back and fix something. Because things change. And here, yeah. Here it's just a random merchant. I'm just giving them for Carper going about how he could be. And I know why I did it, because here by just going Darren, there's a chance that the reader will not remember who Darren is. Forkerberg going on about the quality and how he could get a king's ransom. For this, yeah, well, Ah, hopefully. My editor's probably going to tell me um, if something needs to be changed. They should see Darren, Tibs said, since their merchant had given them such a good deal. Let's not send too many people to him, Jekyll said. I'm hoping we'll get one more run before Hard Knuckle can. I'm hoping. I'm hoping we'll get one more run before Hard Knuckles can make the changes he wants to make. It would be a shame if my favorite merchant was out of coin when we bring him the loot, because once the guild starts paying us, we're going to get screwed worse than Miral on the guard's payday. Tiff shrugged. It'll be what it is. We already know the guild's crooked. He finished his tankard. It's unsettling how at ease you are with that, Kirino said. When you're street, Jekyll said, getting screwed is something you get used to. Although the level to which the guild stoops is still unsettling to me. I don't know how you do it, Tibs. Tibs shrugged. You're straight, he grinned. I'm straight. The fighter grinned and returned. That you are. Since we can't do anything about the guild, Karina asked, any thought on the other thing? Actually, Jekyll said, and motioned Krosov over. Crow, you remember when you told me about the mountains around your city? The server narrowed his eyes. You remember that? Sure. You described how... I told you that like the first day we met. Yes, but I told you about high wind 2 days before we were to meet for it. Not that again. I said Tibbs kicked Jekyll's shin as hard as he could, since the fighter wore his leather armor, and Tibbs was sure he kept his earth skin on all the time under it. Jekyll looked at him. What was that for? You're about to get in a fight with him. I'm not. Trust Tibbs, Krosef said. On things like that, he clearly knows more than you do. Jekyll looked from one to the other. But you brought him over to help, Tibbs said during the fighter's confusion. So let him help. You can fight afterwards. But I don't want to fight. I know, Krosef said, patting Jekyll's shoulder in what seemed to Tibbs a pretty condescending way. It was the fighter's turn to narrow his eyes at Krosef. The server smiled innocently. How can I help? Jekyll looked like he was about to say something, but Karina spoke. You said something about a mountain, Jekyll. Mountains. Mountains, he said, glaring at the sorceress, who smiled before sipping her tankard from her tankard. He smoothed his face and looked at the server again. He said something about how there's a race every year to the top, and it's got something to do with being difficult to breathe. Joseph stared at Jekyll, looked around the dining room, then sat. You remember the weirdest thing. Back home, which is Mountain Sea, every year, during the first ship festival, the tougher men and women of the area, even some from other places, will come to run the mountain top. That's what makes the race a challenge. It isn't that it's long, the trail can take days to walk, or steep in places, but the higher you go, the tougher it is to breathe. It's not going to affect you and me walking there, but when you run, you get tired a lot easier. Hard to breathe, you say? Karina asked. How do you breathe? Ah, I lost my spot. Hard to breathe, you say? Karina asked. Krosef nodded and looked at the three of them. Tibbs expected his thoughtful expression matched Karina. What am I missing? You didn't tell him? Tibbs asked. Jekyll looked hurt. That's not my thing to tell. Before you start fighting with your team, Krosef said, I think I need to clarify something. He doesn't tell me that much, mostly things about him and some of the more exciting things you go through in the dungeon. I can't go in the dungeon, so he tells me about it. Why can't you go? Karina asked before Tibbs could. Pa won't let me. Pa won't let me for one thing. And I'm a server and innkeeper one day. I'm not an adventurer. I like my excitement in a more comfortable surrounding. Crow! The call came from the kitchen. With a sigh, he stood. Dishes got to get washed. Looks like I could help, so I'm glad. Jekyll watched him leave, then at them. Karina raised her hand before he could speak. I'm not giving you advice. He looked at Tibbs. What did I do that was going to start a fight? You understand the incongruity here, right? Karina asked, drawing both their gaze. You're asking Tibbs, who can't be more than 15, about relationships. In street times, 15 is pretty much old age, Jekyll said, grinning. So you're a corpse? Tibbs asked. Ouch, Tibbs, why? I thought you liked me. This is me liking you, he answered. If I didn't, I'd make sure you were one. No wonder you're still alive, Jekyll said. They must all be dead on your street. Only if words killed. In the right mouth, Karina said, they can. But how about we address the biggest problem with Krosev's health, which mainly that we can't go to Mountain Sea. Tells us that if we get high enough, we might be able to do it. So the rooftop of the rooming house? Tibbs asked. Other than the guild building, it was the tallest one, and he didn't want to risk going there. Someone might object. Jekyll looked at Karina, who shrugged. The rooming house isn't. The rooming house it is tonight, he said thoughtfully. Do we want to do something about softening Tibbs's landing? Tibbs looked at the shop. It was new, the last building on the row of a shop. The one opposite was still being built. Behind the counter was a locked box. Bardic had given him an opal to place in it. He wasn't to take anything out. Tibbs was planning to think was be, Tibbs was beginning to think this was just all some elaborate training thing. No matter how many opals he dropped in no matter how many opals he dropped in just as many Tibbs was beginning to think this was just some elaborate training thing. No matter how many opals he dropped in just as many pockets, nothing was happening. It was good practice, and maybe it was a guild rogue thing. Maybe if Tibbs had been the one seeking out Even if Tibbs had been the one seek out Bardic for knife training, and this was supposed to be how he paid for it. He stepped in. The shop smelled sweet, leather, polish oil, but also sugar and spices. The walls were lined with shelves on which bags and boxes were displayed with writing on them. He couldn't read them, so what they were about was a mystery, and not what interested him. The counter was a smooth piece of wood behind which stood a young woman, someone's daughter, he expected, maybe the shop's owner. They all seemed to be owned by older people who used their children or others to work in them. Are you looking for something? She asked. You're new. I want to see what you have. We have sweets and goods from all over the world, she replied enthusiastically, then took in how he was dressed. Tib wore his armor even when he didn't. Tibbs wore his armor when he didn't expect to even when he didn't expect to train. Its weight felt comfortable, and it meant no one took him for one of the workers' son anymore. You look a little young to be one of the runners. I'm the youngest. I'm a rogue. She beamed and leaned forward. She leaned. Uh, she beamed and leaned forward. She leaned in closer. Yeah, that's not. Um, she beamed and leaned forward, then lowered her voice. Are you here to rob us? Tip stared at her, mouth agape, trying to decide if he should be offended she'd think he'd robbed someone in his town, or worried she knew he was planning on breaking into the shop. She laughed. It would be so amazing to be robbed by a runner. Daddy says you're all very good at it. He smiled. I'm not allowed to do it. It's against guild rules. I won't tell them. He chuckled. I wouldn't just lose my hand. He tried to keep his tone light. She was playing with him. They'd strip me of my armor and weapons, then throw me in the dungeon for the rats to eat me. The shudder wasn't an act. They couldn't approach him any more, and yet the idea of them still sent shivers down his spine. They'll send you in there naked? She looked at him over in the way she looked him over the way Jackal looked at Krosef at times, when he didn't think the server could see him. On his friend, the expression was amusing, and he knew Krosef didn't mind being the subject. On her, it was unsettling. He left. He'd be back in the night. Bardic said the opal needed to be in before the sun came up. Tibs looked around, looked at the people assembled in the clearing at the bottom of the hill leading to the. Ah, Tibbs looked around at the people assembled in the clearing. Looked around at the people. They were assembled in the clearing at the bottom of the hill leading to the crack in the mountain. This was so different from the first time he'd been here. For one thing, he could see the mountain. There was no wooden platform for a fighter to stand on and tell them that their future was to be dungeon food. There were a lot fewer people assembled in groups of 2 to 5 teams, or remnants of teams. He noticed Dawn in his really dark purple robe with 2 fighters at his side. When the sorcerer looked around, Tibs moved so a woman was between them. He hoped the sorcerer had forgotten he existed. Do you know what this is about? Karina asked, and the woman turned. I just got here to be just got ordered to be here like you. She noticed Tib and startled. How did you get here? He smiled. I walked. Funny. You're pretty small for a rogue. Means he can get in all the little places, Jekyll said. I was wondering where you were. The order made it sound like if we weren't here, there would be consequences. I thought I might get to fill a team, but there was something at the entrance. He pointed to where the adventurers were standing, their back to the crack, weapons drawn. Looks like they think we're going to attack or something, Kirina said. Did you steal something of theirs, Tibs? Jekyll asked. No, and I'm offended you think I'd say yes to the question. Rogues are smarter than that. Kirina leaned in close to Jekyll. He just insulted you. Jekyll looked surprised. Oh, I guess us fighters are too dumb to know this little thing. Kirina looked at the woman. A fight or two, Tibbs noticed. See what I have to put up with? I'll take that. I'll take them if you don't want them, she indicated Jekyll. That one's cute. That one's taken, Jekyll replied. The woman looked at Kirina, who chortled. What's wrong with me? Jekyll demanded. You're taken? She replied, and I don't even want to think the kind of food I'm going to get served if I anger Krosef. He isn't the cook, but he's the one who brings it to us. I want him to be on my side. Too bad he's on mine, Jekyll replied, grinning. Tibbs looked at the woman. See what I have to put up with? I do, kid, and I do pity you, she grinned. I'd take them off your hand, but my team's full. She looked them over. About time you got here. The 4 looked like they should still be asleep. The rogue had his pants backward and his shirt in his hand. How are you awake after last night? He demanded. Seems I can hold my ale. What's going on? The archer replied. Bah. Seems I can hold my ale, she replied. What's going on? The archer grumbled. I thought the rooming house was a safe place. Then we have adventurers banging on the door and yelling to get here or we're going to be fed to the dungeon. Told you there were going to be consequences, Jekyll told Tibbs. I was already here. Tibbs crossed his arm over his chest. You were late. Jekyll sputtered and turned to the woman. See what I have to put up with? She nodded. Now I see why you 3 are a team. You're Tibbs, the rogue said. You guys are who killed the boss the first time. How did you do it? Well, Jekyll started. Tibbs here. Tibbs kicked his shin and Kirina slapped the back of his head. Sucks not to be able to brag, doesn't it? The woman said. Jekyll turned to Tibbs. See, someone gets it. She's a fighter, Tibbs said. Of course she feels the need to brag too. See what I've had to deal with for the last 10 minutes? She told the rest of his team. Don't look at me. You 3 started it. What did we walk into? The sorcerer asked and yawned wide enough Tibbs saw the back of his throat. Before anyone answered, an adventurer walked by and handed each other a silver bracelet with a yellow gem embedded in it. Even to the other rogue who tried to refuse it. The adventurer didn't answer any of the questions asked. Adventurer didn't answer any of their questions. Kirina put the bracelet on and studied how it looked. Jekyll smirked, put his on, placing her arm next to hers. You wear it better. Do you know how many of us are left? Tibs asked, focusing on the bracelet to see what uh, ta- 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 to see what to see. Okay, this is where I started making changes. This is where I started abandoning the idea of naming of the names being visible. Focusing on the bracelet to see what would appear. Okay, Tibbs asked, focusing on the bracelet to see if something would would appear, would be visible, and was surprised to sense water and earth essence interwoven. Interwoven within it. I hear 400, the archer said. Tibbs noticed his bow was made of a yellow wood as he tried to figure out what the numbers meant. How many team is that? 80, Karina said. That sounded like 8, so it was more than 7, less than 9, but in the tens. He rubbed his temple. Why did numbers have to be so complicated? Don't think too much about it, Tibbs, Jekyll said. You can see that a lot of those who were here are gone. Most of them. They said they didn't care if we all died, and we survived. Focus on that. Just focus on that. Do you think they knew so many would die? Tibbs asked. Remember Ariana, Walter, and the others he'd met and who were gone? Mama. I think, Jekyll said, it's still becoming harder. They didn't know how many of us would survive. They probably expected all of us to die and leave the path clear for the nobles. Do you know what this is about then? Karina asked. Safina's dad researched dungeons, remember? I think this. All right. A voice boomed over the field. Of course it would be him, Jekyll muttered. Hard Knuckle Harry stood at the start of the path leading up to the crack in the mountain. He wore the same dented and scuffed armor he had the first time Tibbs had seen him. My name is Harry. Some of you will have heard me referred to as Hard Knuckle. Plural. Yeah. It's Hard Knuckles. As Hard Knuckles. Tibbs was certain the man looked in their direction when he said that. Cross me and you'll find out why. Mumbling rose, and Tibbs realized maybe Jackal wasn't the only one who had had a run-in with Harry, although Tibbs hadn't realized he'd still been in town. You've been handed bracelet. Put it on your left wrist. Tibbs hesitated as Karina switched hers to that wrist. That was where Bardick's brand was. It was what Alistair robbed. The memory of his time wearing one. He'd seen so many of the adventurers wearing or hiding that wrist. Was that how they'd gotten them? Was that what had stolen ranks from Bardick? Was surviving this long worthy of being punished? Except Bardick said he'd reach a point when Tibbs would be worth Except Bardick said he'd reach a point when Tibbs would be worth too much to be killed. That meant they wanted him to live, didn't it? He looked around at the adventurers walking among them. If he didn't put it on by himself, would they just force it on him? He closed it around his left wrist, where it hung loose, and waited for the others. Some looked at the bracelet like Tibbs had. Maybe they felt the essence through them too. Alistair had taught him something he shouldn't have known. Alistair had taught him something he shouldn't have known yet. Why hadn't the other teachers? The pain brought Tibbs to his knees with a cry. Grasping at the bracelet, he tried to pull it off, but it was tight against his skin. The clasp was gone, leaving a smooth strip of silver. Then he was panting, the pain only a memory. He checked, and the bracelet had shrunk to fit his wrist. The yellow gem glinted in the sunlight. You could have warned us, you son of a whore, Jekyll muttered, sounding angry. Tibs hadn't heard the fighter angry often, and pain didn't usually bother him. The other rogue smirked as Tibs stood, bracelet in hand. Sure, you were the smart one, Tibs thought disdainfully. He helped Karina up, and she was pale. You okay? She nodded. How about you? Jekyll asked the other fighter and sorcerer. Told you guys not to put it on, the rogue said. The smart one among us who The smart one among you haven't put it on, Harry's voice boomed, sounding amused. Now you know what you've got to look forward to, because you aren't leaving this town without that bracelet on. You can try to fake it, but it won't work. You might as well put it on now and get it over with. The rogue looked at the bracelet. His smugness was gone. A woman cried out, and he closed his eyes. The rogue's hand shook, and he muttered curses. Dip realized that Harry had done them a favor. The rogue was anticipating the pain, which was a pain on its own. I take it back, Knuckles, Jekyll whispered, looking around. A lot more people than Tibbs had realized hadn't put it on. Now they were all fighting with their own fears. Tibbs grabbed the rogue's bracelet and put it on the man, then held him as he cried out. The weight nearly toppled him, but he wouldn't move. Felt the ground harden under his feet as he pushed essence into it. You're an asshole, the rogue said once he was no longer in pain. Thanks. I feel that anytime I have to go in the boulder room, Tip said. It's no fun. He pulled the earth essence back into him. With that out of the way, we can move on to the interesting stuff, Harry said. The dungeon is graduating. That means nothing to you, and that's fine. The only thing you need to know is that once it reopens, it's going to be even tougher. Yes, I said reopen. It's closed now. We're not going to let you try to get in because I don't have the time to deal with idiots. The stone can't be moved, melted, broken, or affected by anything. And I'm going to have people guarding it because I know some of you are idiots and won't take the word of someone who's been here where you are, and not those adventurers you've been calling guards. How long it's closed, we don't know, but I can tell you it's going to be at least 2 weeks. Could be as much as months, since I have no intention of dealing with the lot of you in this town while I make the changes I need to make. Those bracelets grant you free passage on the transportation platform. Present it, tell the attendant where you want to go, and they'll take you there. See the world, have fun, enjoy yourself. Do not be in this city until we call you back. The gem on Tib's bracelet darkened, became orange, then red. That's the color. That color is what will tell you to come back. When your bracelet turns that color again, you have 2 days to come back. If you are still wearing it after that, feel free to try and take it off. It's going to turn black. The red darkened until there was no color left. That will mark you for death. Anyone with that on can be killed, and the guild will pay for the bracelet's return, and do so handsomely. I already don't care what happens to you. Once that's black, I'll care even less. Crumbling spread, and a few people played with their bracelet as the gem returned. Crumbling spread, and a few people played with the bracelets as the gems returned to yellow. Tibbs didn't understand them. They were able to leave, go anywhere they wanted. He could go find Mama's killer, make them pay. Jekyll caught his eyes and mouthed something. Mountain Sea. He looked at Tibbs, who nodded. He could get his audience. Now, one thing you need to know, before I set you loose on the world. When you come back, there will be people here, many more. An Upsilon dungeon is open to those who can afford it, not just you lot. We will control how many teams are allowed to form, but you will have people competing for the honor of clearing whatever new tricks and monsters the dungeon comes. I don't like monsters, creatures. Do not ask me why I do not like the term monsters here. Creatures the dungeon comes up with. He turned, stopped, faced them again. Oh, and the guild no longer considers you. Oh, and the guild no longer considers you dungeon food. So there's going to be a cleric at the entrance to make sure you're in good health going in and to heal you as you get out. That's it. That is if you get out. The guild might want you to live now. The dungeon still wants to eat you. And this concludes chapter 28 of Bottom Rung. If you're enjoying this, please subscribe and hit the bell. Share with your friends. Hit the thumbs up. If you want to read the story, it's on Royal Road. The link is in the notes. If you want to support me, the link to my Patreon is also there. And with that, I shall wish you a good day.